Okay, thank you. So welcome everybody to panel 3, A1. And the topic or the theme of today's panel is knowledges. And we have our first paper. We've got the title, I Am Vegan, but I Wear Leather, a systematic review on definitions of veganism term. It's authored by 3 scholars, but we have 2 with us today. So we have Estela Díaz, is a lecturer at, I practice my Spanish, Universidad Pontificia Comila, activist for human and animal rights, NGO advisor and humane educator. Her principal area of interest focuses on ethical and transformative consumption, human-animal relations, gender, sustainable transitions, theories of power and education. And I hope I pronounced this correctly. Gelareh? Yes. Salehi? Yes, Gelareh. Is a PhD candidate at Universidad Pontificia Comila in Madrid, Spain. The current research project are stages of behavioural change to follow vegan diet and French consumers' commitment to meatless Monday in, all these words are tricky for me, I'll say University Grenoble Alpes. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry about what I'm doing to that language. So correct any of those mispronunciations, please, if you want to. Otherwise, I will hand over to our first 2 speakers. And we look forward to hearing your paper.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Gelareh is gonna be uploading there because I have problem with sharing a screen. Yeah, Mark is now putting easier the task, but yeah, so we'll share in a moment. Thank you very much for the patience.
Okay, and I need the permission to share my screen for the presentation if you give it to me. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure I knew that I had to do that. Does anybody know? Are they able to advise me on how to give permission to share a screen to a...
Have you got, Danelle, next to share screen, have you got a little arrow that gives you some options?
Really?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Actually, I don't have any of those options.
I do, it's okay.
No, Danelle should have it.
I do.
So if you click on that,
yes.
I think at the bottom there's advanced options or something like that.
Yes.
Click on that.
Yes.
And then what options have you got there?
So 1 participant can share at a time. Yeah. Multiple participants can share. Who can share? All participants is ticked. Who can start sharing when someone else is sharing? Only host.
Oh.
Have you tried?
That should be fine then.
Yeah, this is I'm sorry, but yeah, this is.
Because that sounds like you've got the right settings, so I don't understand that.
Yeah, so it says how many participants can share at a time. 1 participant can share. Second box, who can share? All participants. Third box, who can start sharing when someone else is sharing? Only the host. So do you want to have a go at sharing that again, or is it blocking you?
Actually, I cannot share the messages that has disabled attendees screen sharing, so I cannot share anything.
That's
okay. I'll go back into the main room and have a chat with Claire to check what's happening. Okay.
Okay. I just wanted to add on my end, I can share my screen. So I'm not sure what's happening.
Okay. So you can share yours. Okay. We'll see what Brett finds out when he comes back. I wonder if you should maybe email the presentation to Estela in case it's something maybe with your setup.
Yes,
Yeah,
but
just in
still I'm
case.
disabled to sharing. I share it with Richard. I think Estela will have the same problem, because we are disabled to share anything, that's the message that we receive.
Yes.
So
another option is if you do send it to Darren or me, for example, we could share our screen and then you could just say slide.
Okay.
We could send you our email if you'd like.
Yes, that would be.
Okay, sure. Yes. Yeah.
Because yes, I have the same message. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. The same message.
Yes, that's my problem exactly. So let me just have your email to send it to you.
So what if you choose the option that everybody can share? Is that the option now that is selected? Because I don't have any button. So I'm just inventing or try to think of a solution. So, but I don't have any, just share screen and that's it. That's the only thing I have.
So we've just tried to play around with things and we don't know what the problem is. So that's helpful.
Sorry, can I try sharing my screen real quick just to make sure? Okay.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you.
Okay.
Nice.
Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now.
Yeah, congratulations.
Okay, so this works. Cool.
So a solution could be, Estela, can you email me your presentation and I can share my screen with it and you'll just have to tell me when to click?
Yes. Can you send in via chat your email so I can send it to you?
Okay, I'll do that. And then I don't know if you want to do, I don't know if this is what conversation you just had. If Darren and Stephanie go first and then we'll sort this out.
We just had the conversation about emailing the presentation to somebody else to put up. So we could change the order, or do you think that will come through quickly?
And that will be fantastic. Chang also, Darren, Chang, that will be fantastic. But also, I don't know, it will be nice just for asking if we can click, otherwise it will be next. I mean, we can do it, but I think it will be
I think you're going to have to ask next, and I'm fine to do that. And so Danelle, if you want to chair, and I'll just be adminning the PowerPoint.
Okay. So would you like to go first still and just send that through now, or would you like for me to maybe ask Lukas or Stephanie or Darren to present in a changed order?
You know what, that would be nice. I think that is the idea that we start so in the meantime we try to fix this.
Okay.
So I will I will send it to Bril. I think I see this is bread meals. Yeah, that's okay. So I will send it here. Okay.
Just that potentially means other people who come in during the panel who wanted to see one of the latter talks may miss them.
That's true too. But
okay. What do you think, Lukas? Are you happy to jump ahead?
I mean, I'm sending it right now, so. Yes,
I actually sent it, but I don't know.
You sent it, Gelareh? Okay.
Yes, to the email that Estela wrote here, dear Stephanie wrote here. Yes, I sent it.
Let's see if Brett gets it maybe in just 10, 20, 30 seconds.
I'm staring at my email.
Refresh.
I've yet to receive.
Actually, I don't have your email, dear Darren. So the only email that I can see in the chat is with Stephanie, so I sent it.
I've yet to receive it. Oh, I have it.
Okay, well, let's go ahead with the first presentation as prepared. We've maybe lost 10 minutes of our discussion time at the end, so apologies for that, but we know what this is like. So when you're ready to share that screen, that would be lovely, Stephanie.
Just opening.
Maybe Stephanie, you can choose that that other people can click on the. Let's see if we can have it. No.
Yes, I'm sorry.
So I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry because I'm gonna be like, Stephanie, please next. So it's good that we are amongst friends and everything is understandable. So that's okay. So thank you very much. I think that you can see the presentation, and Stephanie, you can hide the other one if you can. If I'm asking, I'm very.
It's just that little lectern button on the bottom right. Oh, perfect.
That's good. Fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for inviting us to present our research, ongoing research. This is just a preliminary sharing of the results, the preliminary results that we have in this research. Is about, the title is very illustrative, is I'm vegan, but I wear leather. So a systematic review on definition on veganism. Next, Stephanie. Thank you. So I will go to introduction, objectives, methodology, preliminary results, and also the takeaways. So Gelareh also will join us, and she will talk more about the methodology and the results. Okay. So this is the sign, Stephanie. Thank you. So I will start saying what is the starting point of our research. Is like, okay, language is really important. So how can we communicate? It creates reality, and also language and discourses that we know, that we use, is really important because it creates ideology, structures, power relationships. So we need to be very conscious about the language and the terms that we use. And so also, of course, because human animals is in our society, so we also, the way that we relate to non-human animals, the terms that we use to talk about them also creates reality. And it's very important that we start seeing these things. And specific discourses reproduce society, reproduce the discourses, our relationships, reinforce our relationship with animals. So it's very important to focus on this. And of course, researchers as us also create a part of this reality and create society. So for researchers, especially, language is very important because we study, understand, and measure phenomena. And for that reason, we need to be very clear about the terms that we use. So in this case, we are going to present, we focus on veganism, vegetarianism, and other related phenomena. So also we know that the interest of non-human animals in general, and also veganism, other phenomena related to animals, vegetarianism, reductionism, plant-based diet, is growing in the last decades. This is just a figure of veganism. So we can see how it's growing, the interest is growing, and it keeps growing, especially also in COVID. We're hearing more and more the reference to animals and also veganism or our lifestyles. So also the starting point was that we have, there is a lack of regulation about vegans, vegan terms, vegetarian terms. I mean, it's under debate. And also there is no agreement on those terms. Even for example, vegan food, vegan products, veganism, vegetarianism, so we're still growing. I mean, we're growing, but at the same time, we are not in agreement of the terms that we're using to conduct research or even in the market. So in policymaker, consumers, so we were wondering, and also we were focusing and interested on studying these things. So the main objective of this research, this is part of the bigger and more ambitious research, is to study and analyze the conceptual approaches of researchers towards veganism, vegetarianism, and other issues related to non-human animals. So other questions that are related to this is, do researchers define in their research the terms? Do they use them? Do they define when they are going to study? How are they defining the terms? What frame of reference, mental model, philosophical tradition they use to refer to this kind of phenomenon? Also the definition, there is some question, depend on the journal of discipline. This is really important, as we will see, and we'll talk more in the takeaways. So at what extent also the discourses and definition have changed over time? It's possible that it was very clear a long time ago, and now is a confusion. Is that possible? So is justice, morality, politics, consumption, I mean, there are all these terms and other phenomena around the discourse and terms and definitions of vegetarianism, veganism, plant-based diet, etc. So this study is to focus on analyzing the conceptual, but the purpose is to see the big picture. So what we're doing as our researchers and how we are contributing to this growth of literature, and also to clarify concept if it's necessary, and also to offer side guidance in way of proposition or some guidance to researchers to say, okay, you need to focus on this and this and this, or when we use this, we meant to say this and this. So our studies align with the call made by Vegetarian Union and also other stakeholders, food business, consumers, and it has pointed by different authors say that we need some clarity to study, but also to promote that in the market and to clarify our position and also to promote our relationship, or to create concrete realities. So in this presentation, we are going to focus on the preliminary results only on veganism, okay? So we are also adding and conducting the research towards vegetarianism, plant-based diet, and other terms. But for now, in this presentation, we'll focus on veganism. And now I will hand over the word to my colleague.
Thank you, Estela. So just to be continued regarding the methodology that we utilize systematic review for our data collection. So regarding the systematic review, in the next slide, as is illustrated, as you can see by the keyword vegan, we go through electronic databases, which resulted in around 3,000 papers. And then we designed a selection protocol. And regarding the selection criteria, we only focused on those that are non-medical studies in English, but we didn't consider any exclusion criteria regarding any region that these studies are conducted or which countries they are. So we selected and reviewed all of them, which resulted in 655 papers that we got through them. First, we coded the general characteristics of these papers regarding the publication year, other authors, references, and the main descriptives of each paper that we have. As you can see in the next slide, for the data analysis, after coding the general data, we conducted terminological and concept analysis. By this methodology, we focused on the terms that how the term vegan and its variety like veganism, vegans, vegan diet, how this term is utilized by authors and how it defines in different scholars. And we followed our analysis through interpretive phenomenological analysis. By this methodology, which is rooted in the fact that the authors have the authority to give the reality to each term. So it's really important to see the scholars that they are studying veganism, how they consider it. If they consider it as a lifestyle or a political movement, or they just decrease the concept to only one aspect, which is diet. So this was the next step of our analysis. In the next slide, as you can see, we are showing you our initial results regarding this is the sample of the studies that we reviewed. As you can see, these studies are usually published. Around half of them are published in Appetite Journal, and then the trend is followed by Sustainability Journal and Food Quality and Preferences. As you can see in the next slide, after the publication, this is one of the really interesting trends that we saw, that there is a revolution in the academic interest of the scholars toward the veganism. So that's why it makes it much more important to make sure that this phenomena is defined correctly and completely through the literature. As you can see, through one or two regarding the 40 years ago till now, that we have more than hundreds of papers per year regarding veganism. After publication year, we can see here as, okay, this is the trend and this is the revolution regarding the interest of scholars, but how they consider the concept. As you can see, most of these papers, the majority of them, more than half of them, they focus only on quantitative methodology. So maybe it could be a guess that the phenomena is not really deeply analyzed, and we are in need of more qualitative and conceptual methodologies in the future. And after having a really general view of what kind of sample we really studied regarding the papers, in the next slide, I'm going to show the first research questions that we have. If all these studies define veganism or not, as you can see, 61% of the sample of studies, they didn't define the term veganism. They are studying it, they utilize the term, but there was no definition regarding the phenomena that they are talking about. And then focusing on, okay, on the 39% that they defined it, how they defined it. In the next slide, as you can see, one of the first initial results that we see is that the most frequent definitions they utilize is the vegan society. But more frequent, it doesn't mean that all of them they are using it. It's just it appeared more than 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. But if you can see where these definitions appeared in the next slide, surprisingly, none of those major papers that they are focused on veganism are utilizing this definition. So we find this really great and promising definition, not in Appetite, not in other journals, in other different journals that they are not JCR and they are not indexed in Web of Science. After showing that the frequent main promising definition, then I'm going to explain in the next slide about the problems that we saw in our initial results. The first thing is the big confusion that you can see regarding the definitions. In the next slide, as an example of this confusion, you can see that these are just some examples that, okay, vegans are some parts of veganism, and vegans are excluding this, excluding that, and there are some kind of relapse regarding these definitions. And at the end of the day, if someone doesn't know the phenomena, they could interpret it totally differently, and that results in different measuring, in the quantitative papers. The second problem in the next slide, as you can see, is that they are considered most of the papers, only the dietary aspect of veganism, but it's the lifestyle in consider the clothing, the entertain, the sport choices, and many other aspects of consumers' life. But the definitions in the next slide, I put some examples that you can see. Veganism is a diet. Veganism is a diet. So you can see it several times, so it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle, it's a movement, but we cannot see it in the related literature. The third problem in the following slide, as you can see, is that it's usually defined in the umbrella of vegetarianism. And in the following slide, you can see the example of that. Okay, we have an umbrella like vegetarian diet, and veganism is a part of those diets, but it's usually not only diet, and it's not could be included in that umbrella. So we notify and identify that for the future. And the fourth problem, after having these problems, as you can see, it's usually when the authors want to even define it, they start with some negative points. I don't know why, like the most restrictive one, vegans are going to vegan wash other omnivore consumers, and these are not actually the facts. These are only some assumptions, and these are happening several times, especially the term restrictive. But usually those vegans are really enjoying and choosing this lifestyle. It's not restricting them, it gives you a variety of options. And in the following slides, the last but not the least is that it's usually considered only as a personal choice. It's just like purchasing choice, dietary choice, but the phenomena is much more wider and broader than just a personal choice. So they didn't consider it, especially in quantitative papers, they didn't consider it as a social, political, and ethical movement, which should be considered in the future. These were just our initial results regarding the content analysis and phenomena analysis, and I give Estela the rest of the presentation for the final points. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. 5 minutes left.
Estela, we are not hearing you.
Estelle, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, yeah, because I had it muted, so sorry. So thank you very much, Stephanie and Gelareh. Thank you very much. So one of the takeaways is this is a mess. When we started doing the research, it was, we have been studying this for a while. My PhD was on veganism years ago, and now Gelareh is also on veganism, but this is a mess. It was very difficult to put order on this. So the first takeaway is this is a mess, we need to do something, okay? So in the next slide, Stephanie, so it's very important that we say that striving for clarity is not because we're looking for purity. Sometimes they have been accused us you look for something that is not real, but it's not about orthodoxy, it's about orthopraxis. So if we cannot manage it, we cannot measure it. And measuring, we talk about understanding, analyzing, not just measuring like a quantitative, okay? And we cannot measure it, we cannot define it well. That's the problem. We need to define it very well just to understand the phenomenon. So the next slide, Stephanie, thank you. So the actual situation creates uncertainty. And also for the activist point of view, there's a big chance, an important chance that we'll enter into anything goes mode, because we have seen everything in the literature, that people that I'm vegan but I wear leather, that's the title, or I'm vegan but sometimes I eat chicken. It's this is a mess, but maybe part of the problem is the definition that we're using as activists, as researchers, etc. So of course there is a danger that increased misunderstanding, and that's as a consequence decrease the impact of our cause. So in the next slide also, this is just some of the questions that we need to be addressed. Should we claim the term again? It's our term? Years ago I've been saying I'm vegan, and I need to explain. That was a pain in the ass. Yes, it was a pain in the ass to explain that I'm vegan, but people have the better idea of vegan was. Now, who is that claim? Who is the owner of the claim of the term? And I know that language is dynamic, it changes in the culture, but do we have some ownership of that term? Do we want some ownership? Also, should we agree on terms? Do we need new terms? For example, I'm open to this one. It's let's recuperate our term and then propose new terms for new food or products or whatever it will come in the future. Also, who has the power? Who has the power to conceptualize them, right? The market. We should leave to the movement, the consumer, companies, influencers. Influencers use the terms completely in different ways. So in the next slide also we'll finish. So we need to reflect on the mental models that we use as researchers, practitioners, consumers, etc. Our roles and influence when we write a paper. What kind of terms are we using? What kind of definition? Because that's telling a story, and it will tell a different story, depends on the definition that we use. And also the different power relationship. I'm very concerned about this, the power that the journals agendas has, because maybe we are just changing our language depending on the journal that we want to publish. So what is the power relationship there? Maybe we should go to another journal, right? Instead of just publishing. Although I know that we are also receiving pressure from the academy to publish in several, in concrete. But I don't know, I think that something should be done in that, because it's our freedom as researchers. And I promise we are finishing. we think that our paper contributes to the critical animal study. Stephanie, if you are, thank you, because we are understanding some of the hidden dynamics and positions, the language and the discourse that exists hidden in the research. And on top of that, I mean, what we're doing, and that's the next slide, and the last one, as we aim to make visible the invisible. Okay, that's the main point. Things that we not normally see, just to be aware and start using language as we would like to, and also according to our cause. Thank you very much for the attention. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you.
Danelle, your mic's not on.
Should have started some kind of award for people who, yeah, everyone's done it so far. I'm among company. So yeah, I was just saying, very important and interesting paper. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and to our speakers as well. And that we will move on just for time. And then I wasted 5 minutes. No, I didn't, just a few minutes. So thank you. So our next paper, Challenging Anthropocentrism in Continental Philosophy Through Animal Resistance, Lukas Leitinger, I hope I pronounced that correctly. If not, please let me know. An MA student in Political Philosophy at UPF Barcelona. He is especially interested in animal resistance and the myriad of ways it challenges our thinking and informs our activism. Over to you, Lukas.
Thank you very much. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. Can you all see in here? Perfect. So welcome everybody. Today I want to talk about animal resistance in continental philosophy, which is also the topic of my master's thesis, which I just finished writing. So the overall idea of this paper is to kind of get a conversation between continental philosophy and critical animal studies and animal activism more generally. And for those of you who are not in philosophy, continental is kind of the counterpart of analytical philosophy, whereas analytical is more concerned with logical arguments, like from A follows B follows C, this kind of philosophy. Continental is more concerned with topics like history, politics, interpretation. And this is the field that I'm in today for this presentation. And especially I want to point out two names in continental philosophy. Jacques Derrida and Foucault are very important in this field. And I will also try to conceptualize my topic of animal resistance on those two thinkers. So I want to start with Derrida and his very important book, The Animal That Therefore I Am. And one of the central arguments that he's making in this book is to critique this idea of the animal as this kind of abstracted notion that captures wide diversity of beings, of non-human animals, as we know, into one abstract notion. And he's especially concerned about the way this idea of the animal has been used in the Western philosophical tradition. So it's usually used to define the human against the animal. So the animal is seen to lack certain abilities, certain capacities, and the human has been traditionally always defined against this animal. So Derrida is very critical towards this kind of conceptual violence that is done onto the animal, as we say. And one of the alternatives that he proposes is this kind of view of not seeing them as the animal, but instead of like a singular other, or kind of an irreplaceable existence. So this kind of being that is described here is never fully captured by these categories. So he's talking especially about a cat, and he says this cat, this singular other, exists before he sees the cat. And so the cat both precedes and exceeds categorization. What this means is all the terms we try to put on this cat, like cat or animal or it or she, they never fully capture this existence. We can never fully understand this irreplaceable existence. And I think it is in this sense that we can find the first understanding of resistance here. And I think in precisely this kind of existence, this singular other that we can never fully capture with our ideas, with our categories, with our terms, from animal to cat, etc., there is this resistance against these categories. And I think in this sense, their very existence is resistance in a sense. And I think this is also very interesting if we move from the cat, from Derrida, to other cases, like for example, a cow. And here we can see that there are actually very different terms in place that also serve a different function. Terms such as livestock or cattle not only try to capture the cow into a certain concept, but this concept also has a certain political weight. Both of these terms, livestock and cattle, denote that this is a property. This is a property to be exploited. So if we follow through on this logic and follow through on this argument that the singular other is resisting the categorizations that we put on them, then this resistance also challenges these ideas of livestock and cattle, the property that is inherent in those terms. And so this resistance goes a bit further and challenges the property idea in the first place, and of course also their role in the animal industry. And based on this, Derrida's second very important point is about the ethical encounter. So he is quite critical towards kind of universal moral ethical frameworks, such as, for example, utilitarianism, that try to provide a universal idea of what is right or what is ethical to do. And instead, Derrida locates ethics from a thinker called Emmanuel Levinas. And here it's all about the ethical encounter. And it's the encounter specifically with this singular other, with this being that I explained before. And it is by facing this other that I'm interrupted in my thinking, that I'm challenged in my beliefs, and my egoism is challenged. So instead of trying to find universal ethical moral norms, Derrida is concerned with this kind of encounters that challenge my egoism, which is the basis of his ethics. And I think also here we can see that we are encountering this resistance as a very interesting way of understanding our ethical relations with animals. And this is both in the very striking way as in the picture that you see below of like a cow, for example, jumping a fence, but also I believe in the way that I've described before, it's the base existence that we can never fully understand, that always exceeds our categories and our understandings of this being. If we encounter this resistance, it can challenge us to rethink our beliefs and our egoism, and this can be an interesting way that it can inform our ethics or make us reflect on our ethics. And the second thinker I want to talk about is Foucault, and especially his conceptualization of power and resistance from the history of sexuality. And in brief, the idea is where there's power, there's resistance. So those two ideas always go hand in hand in a way. They're kind of each other's counterpoint. One doesn't make sense without the other. If there's no power, there cannot be resistance. If there is no resistance, there cannot be power. Those two always have to go together, because otherwise they don't exist in this understanding. And it's very important to note that for Foucault, this is not one giant side of power and one giant universal side of resistance, but these kind of struggles, this kind of back and forth are played out across multiple points, and they're always very context specific to a certain time, certain history, etc. And while Foucault has been only interested in humans on this kind of power resistance dynamics, there is very interesting work by Dinesh Vadivel, who has tried to apply these ideas also to non-human relationships, like power resistance relationships. And so while Foucault tries to understand or analyze resistance as a way to show or better understand power, Dinesh Vadivel kind of turns this around and looks at the measures of power to better understand resistance. So in the case of fish, it is kind of difficult to empirically see, is this fish actually resisting, or what this debate would even entail. So instead, the focus is on the technologies of violence. So if we understand that power and resistance always go together, we can also have a look at the measures of the technologies that are developed to oppose this resistance. And the very simple example is, of course, the hook. So the idea here is that the fish have to be basically resisting all the time. They are elusive. They don't want to be caught. They don't want to be killed. This is their main form of resistance. And it's only because of this that we need to, or we have developed the hook. And the hook is specifically built to counter the resistance of the fish that doesn't want to be caught. And also one extra step about the hook is that it tries to co-opt the energy of resistance. So when the fish is caught and tries to struggle to get away, which is an act of resistance, the hook sinks deeper into the side of the fish. So it is built in a very specific way to both counter and co-opt animal resistance. And it wouldn't really make sense to build this technology of the hook if there wasn't the resistance in the first place. And we can also expand this idea beyond, of course, exactly the fish hook to see all the technologies of violence, from the cages, the pens, the slaughterhouses, etc. They're all always measures to try to answer to the resistance. So the resistance is there beforehand. It's kind of this unruliness and simply wanting to live, in a sense. And then all these technologies of violence come as a response, as a trying to curtail that, but never being fully successful. And this is the kind of power resistance dynamics that are enabled through a Foucauldian perspective. And the second very important part in Foucault is this focus on epistemology, which is what we can know, and history, which is, of course, a big theme throughout his work. And here I also want to bring a very important book, The War Against Animals, by, again, Dinesh Variwal. And he takes a largely Foucauldian perspective and talks about the war against animals and how this is kind of coded as peace in our system of truth. So for Foucault, the way epistemology works is that we find ourselves in a certain system of truth. And this kind of marks the boundaries of what we can think, what we can even imagine. And so this book shows very interestingly how the war is coded as peace. And if we remember that power and resistance are always going together, we can now see that like war is kind of the power, the violence side of this story. That if we cannot see the war already in our current system of truth, it's also difficult to see the resistance, because it doesn't really make sense of what would these animals resist against if we don't even cannot even comprehend the war that is going on. But I think the flip side is also true, that in order to challenge this system of truth, the two of them have to be shown together, so that there's both war, the power side of the story, and also the resistance. So I think this is a very fruitful way to also challenge the status quo. And also to look a little bit more specifically at history, it's important to note that this idea that resistance and also the war against animals is kind of coded as peace, it's kind of hidden, has not always been the case. So this very interesting paper by Jason Ribble starts around in the 17th century and shows that animal resistance was actually quite well known. So people who were working with animals, and also in general culture and literature, it was quite prevalent in the historical records that humans knew that animals resisted all the time. And this was partly for practical reasons, because in this kind of what Ribble calls the unspoken negotiation, if you are working with and you're exploiting animals, you have to know quite well their resistance, because as we have learned, the very technologies that were developed, from cutting tendons to making bigger fences, etc., they are always responses to resistance. So in order to develop them, you have to understand the resistance in the first place. And for Ribble, there's three options. You can either treat them nicer, you can treat them harsher, or you abandon this relationship. And so in all of this, resistance is very commonly known, because it's kind of necessary. We have to understand resistance in order to develop all of these technologies of violence against it. And so it's important to see that resistance has not always been hidden in the way we might not see it today in our common discourse. And Ribble also interestingly suggests that in these like common experiences of seeing both the resistance and the exploitation, Ribble sees the roots of the animal rights movement with the early Pythagoreans in the 17th century. And now I want to bring in another interesting book by Matthew Gelareh, which is about the indistinction approach. So this is kind of a general, a new theme in animal philosophy that emphasizes that there is no ontological human-animal difference. So there's no inherent distinction between humans and animals and potentially other beings. And this is quite a difference from many other approaches in animal philosophy. And it tries to emphasize that. And it's also very interesting. So the idea here is to open up new ways of thinking. So what happens if we decenter the human, if we don't take human and humanity as the center of our philosophy, of our philosophical frameworks, and what kind of new ways, what new shared zones of existences open up. So this is kind of the approach that I was inspired by, and I was trying to see if resistance can be one way of entering indistinction, so to say. And even though I've focused mainly on animal resistance in this presentation, I think if we think through it from this indistinction perspective, we can see that resistance is something that does not properly belong to humans or animals. It is something that is shared. It's like a base condition that does not properly belong to either. So in this way, we can see resistance as such a shared zone that we share between humans, animals, and potentially also other beings. And the second important part is that indistinction often plays along a sort of longer time scale to decenter the human and to see that human and human philosophy, etc., is kind of new and recent in all of this, and we're kind of latecomers. And I think we can apply this kind of long time scale to all of the themes that I have brought up so far. So the kind of dynamics of resistance, they predate humans. They predate that humans start to categorize animals in a certain way and subjugate them and develop the technologies of violence. So it's a much older kind of dynamic of power and resistance, and humans are quite latecomers, both in their technologies of violence and also in the animal philosophy that tries to make sense of this. And there's even a case to be made that animal philosophy only originated out of seeing or out of encountering this resistance, which is kind of interesting, I believe.
5 minutes left. Thank you.
And trying to come back now to my starting flowchart, where I try to combine continental philosophy and critical animal studies and try to see what one can learn from the other in a way. And this is kind of interesting also given the previous presentation on veganism. So there's often this idea that veganism is a sort of ethical endpoint. It's like this cruelty-free, violence-free life. And this is what is ethical when it comes to animals. Like this is sort of the answer. And I think here continental philosophy can be very helpful in challenging these ideas that ethics is something that can be fully answered. And we have found a solution now in terms of animal ethics, it's veganism. And this is the end of the debate. And continental philosophy is very critical towards this kind of shutting down and finding very clear answers. And now the debate is settled. And I was trying to combine the two and trying to find a convergence. And I think the idea that I came up with that I like the most is to kind of see veganism not as an endpoint, but as an ethical starting point. So it's kind of a precondition for seeing animal resistance, for having this kind of encounters, for having this continuous ethical reflection. So it allows us to generally see animals and to have these continuous reflections. And I think in this way, we can still kind of keep to the importance of our own actions, of our veganism, but don't treat it as like the end to everything that we know already what ethical relations towards animals are. Because in this perspective, this is not something we can ever fully find fixed answers to, but instead it's this constant reflection. And I think veganism, even though I'm not 100% sure which definition I'm using here, given the previous presentation, can be kind of a starting point for starting this journey in each of us. And also going the other way around, I think it's quite clear that continental philosophy has very anthropocentric roots and is still largely anthropocentric. And I have tried to kind of engage a little bit some of the thinkers, and I think critical animal studies and activism in general can kind of push for this, for challenging anthropocentrism more generally. And even within the animal part of continental philosophy, we can be more critical towards the individual involvement, very specifically, of course, about veganism. So that this is not lost in just some abstract theorizing and it doesn't matter what we do in our own lives. I think here, critical animal studies, and the right side of my chart here, can be quite helpful in putting that at the center, not forgetting that between all the theorizing and philosophizing. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Lovely, that was a fantastic paper. I wrote some questions of my own down, so if nobody else has any, though I'm sure they will, I would like to get in line. So our final speakers, we have Stephanie Eccles and Darren Chang. Title of their paper, Animal Intimacies and Animal Liberation, Differences and Challenges in Cross-Disciplinary Work. Stephanie is a PhD student at Concordia University in Canada. The dissertation project asks how climate mitigation measures can perpetuate environmental injustices and drive climate change. To explore this question, she is tracking the development of the biogas farmed animal waste to energy industry in North Carolina and how it further entrenches farmed animals, communities, and our shared planet to an unjust future at the expense of animal agribusiness, oligopolistic world building project. I've never said that word in my life until today. And Darren is a PhD student at the University of Sydney, Australia, and a member of the Multi-Species Justice Collective at the Sydney Environmental Institute. His current research explores how animal sanctuaries could be a generative site for solidarity between animal liberation and decolonization. Over to our speakers. Thank you.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, can hear you and
cool.
see your
Perfect.
slide. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so just want to quickly apologize for my sluggishness and drowsiness here because I'm actually not in Sydney currently. I'm on the west coast of Canada and it's 4:30 in the morning here. But yeah, I'll try my best to work through this. So, okay, so quickly, just the outline of the presentation. First, I will be talking about the epistemological tensions between critical animal studies and other fields and why this matters and is important. And then Stephanie in part 2 will talk about the implications that this has on our research and advocacy methodologies. And then we'll end with just some concluding thoughts and questions. So I want to start off by saying that that we're not anti-science, but we're just kind of critical of science and what we're about to say, just to have that premise there. So so over the past few years, we've kind of observed that in many disciplines like geography, anthropology, and other fields, and animal welfare science in particular has been doing this for a long time, that there's this sort of move towards wanting to get to know other species of animals more intimately, right? And a lot of times this is through various kinds of field work, often through scientific methodologies. And I want to say that, you know, this work is highly important. It is for animal advocacy, for anyone who's doing animal rights or animal liberation related work, and that the information produced about the complex sociality and cognition and behaviors and even cultures of other species of animals helps us to, you know, better make arguments, moral, political arguments in terms of, on behalf of non-human animals, and that ethology, and when it's liberation and justice oriented, and even often when it's not, just simply like the knowledge that's produced about the animals, even inform a lot of work within critical animal studies on things like animal cultures and animal resistance, such as those done by Surratt Culling and Lauren Corman. And so the problem, though, is that, you know, oftentimes a lot of this work does not directly benefit other species of animals. And so I think there's an importance for us to kind of question how we might want to decenter science as sort of a primary, dominance, sort of dominating form of knowledge about animals that sort of frames how we can know who the animals are and how we can relate to them. And so this work has actually been done by Dinesh Wadawal in the paper "Do Fish Resist?", which Lukas mentioned in his presentation. And the importance of talking about epistemologies is that it really frames what we know and what is possible. And so Dinesh says one example of an epistemology is the system of knowledge that has been built around the scientific method, which has relied upon making systematic and repeated observations of the world and phenomena. And so this relying on science really has this way of limiting our understandings of who the animals are. And in his paper, Wadawal challenges that by offering understanding animal resistance as an alternative way of making moral arguments on behalf of animals, instead of relying on traditional animal rights theory often base their moral arguments and political arguments on things like sentience, that has to be scientifically validated and legitimized, in terms of arguing for whether animals can even feel pain and have certain types of experiences and relationships. That instead Wadawal takes this alternative route that directly looks at that technologies that are necessary in order to curtail animal resistance. Okay, so quickly switching gear a little bit, just to talk about when Stephanie and I first started discussing these issues, we kind of decided it's important to go back to some of the foundational kind of work and text on critical animal studies. So we went back to the book Defining Critical Animal Studies. And in it, there are these principles that are outlined on what CAS is all about, right? And if we look at it, there's this really strong emphasis on the importance of being interdisciplinary and collaborative in building alliance and solidarity with other movements, and this sort of more holistic approach in understanding the connections of various forms of oppressions. And so it is this very kind of like humble and receptive way of engaging with other forms of knowledge, other disciplines, recognizing the necessity of that. And this slide just, again, that those principles are reflected in a lot of the titles in that book when we're talking about, more holistic pedagogy, understanding of the world, critical animal studies is interdisciplinary, these kinds of stuff. So this move, I characterize it as a move towards commensurability, right? And this is not new. So to make different bodies of knowledge commensurable has been done. So for example, for environmental justice scientists and advocates, they have often argued that specialized scientific knowledge need not be sort of they're actually complementary and compatible with a lot of different forms of local knowledge, for example, indigenous people's traditional ecological knowledge, and that these can actually work together and provide us with a more kind of complete, or at least a more effective understanding of certain realities and experiences. So a quick anecdote on this kind of move in that sort of actually got Steph and I talking about these issues is we were recently in an animal studies reading group, and we read this excellent paper by Becca Franks, who's a researcher at NYU, who's an animal welfare scientist and ethologist. And yeah, so she has this excellent paper on what do animals want, and highly recommended. And this is not a critique of Becca at all, just to make that clear. But in our discussions, someone mentioned that if you read what Becca Franks is saying in the paper, the sort of important things to consider when we're asking non-human animals questions through scientific methods, it seems clear that animal rights and animal liberation principles are almost become a necessity in guiding how the scientific research is done. It should serve as some sort of a scaffold. And I was critical of that, again, not in the sort of anti-science kind of way of being critical of it, but simply recognizing that, if we were to look at the entire history of the relation between non-human animals and the discipline of just science in general, I think it's fair to argue that by and large, the predominant relation between science and non-human animals is one that's characterized by domination and violence, and that even to this day, there's a severe lack of humility, I guess, within within various fields of science where researchers are working directly with non-human animals that can be described as respectful, ethical, non-exploitative, etc. So then the question becomes, perhaps it's important to at least sort of decenter scientific knowledge as sort of a primary sort of way of, in shaping our understanding and thinking about other species of animals. So going back to commensurability, that other peoples and communities have sort of talked about that a lot of knowledges are perhaps not really commensurable. So indigenous scholars and activists have discussed this in terms of not just environmental justice, but addressing these various ways of knowing the world. And they pointed out that, where scientific knowledge is concerned, often, they still retain the primacy of our way of understanding the world, while other worldviews and forms of knowledge are at best described and considered alternative, right? So they're relegated to being secondary or less. And for example, so Kim Tallbear has a talk on YouTube where she talks about how indigenous worldviews are often not considered legitimate forms of knowledge, but merely described as spiritual beliefs, right? So they're not, they're only considered as sort of like an add-on. And worse still, there are other scholars and activists who have critiqued that, the Thur move towards commensurability to incorporate the knowledge of historically marginalized peoples could simply be considered acts of appropriation and or exploitation of the intellectual labor of these oppressed peoples if we're not actually taking the entirety of their worldview seriously, and we're just kind of like cherry picking or like not actually even giving proper credit to where that knowledge comes from. And so she's seeing this in various forms of like new materialist and post-humanist type work, where there's been this sort of ontological turn towards recognizing agency and stuff like that in more than human beings and entities. So just some preliminary food for thought before I end my section and Steph take over. So I just kind of want to ask these kind of big questions, right? So to what extent is critical animal studies or total liberation more broadly defined early on in its development commensurable with other worldviews? If we're to understand critical animal studies as sort of itself producing a certain type of worldview about our relations with other species of animals, has CAS's own commitment to being holistic and all these other things that I mentioned earlier have effectively opened itself up to other forms of knowledge that have in turn exposed CAS's own narrowness and limitations in terms of commensurability with other forms of relating to and knowing more than humans? Do existing tensions between CAS and other fields perhaps help to, and do these different bodies of knowledge help to explain why that other competing theories and worldviews, so for example, strands of post-humanism that are actually compatible with furthering anthropocentric interests through killing and exploitation of other species of animals, been more convincing to other movements and fields or disciplines. So I think these things are important to keep in mind because they have a big impact on how CAS is able to influence other movements and disciplines in their thinking about other species of animals, and whether that's effective or not when we're talking about appraising critical animal studies on that front, I guess. So now pass it over to Stephanie.
Okay, thank you, Darren. Okay, so I want to shift the conversation a bit to talk about questions and challenges related to conducting or doing critical animal studies. So to start, I would like to invite us all to think about a question proposed by Greta Gard, who reflected upon animal studies and other disciplines that engage with human-animal relations having hugely benefited academia, but she was not sure has it been good for animals? Which I think is an overarching question that's guiding this conference. So to tackle this question, I want to foreground one of the core values of CAS, the activist scholar. Slide. Arguably, this is one of the most prominent methodological guides CAS has uplifted. However, as I will stress today, loosely discussed and under-theorized in relation to methodological practices. I will talk about the role of the activist scholar as a firm characteristic of doing CAS work and how this intersects with broader questions of methods, namely what has been hosted under the umbrella of multi-species ethnography that is deeply motivated to intimately, for better or worse, know animals. Slide. Okay, thank you. So for this conference, probably like so many of us, I did return to the anthology defining critical animal studies. Upon my rereading, I was impressed that each chapter is explicitly oriented towards advocating for the activist scholar as expressed in Principle 3, that reads, eschews narrow academic viewpoints and the debilitating theory for theory's sake position in order to link theory to practice, analysis to politics, and the academy to the community. So there's a fierce encouragement within CAS to be an activist scholar, or as described by Glasser and Roy in their chapter, it's our duty. They go further to offer an 11th principle of CAS outlined as, we seek to develop a CAS that insists that scholars remain accountable to their research subjects. It is this principle that I want to recuperate into discussions of methodology. Slide. So as we attempt to foreground animal subjectivity in our work, we come up against a wall. As knowing animals intimately means we typically consult animal behavioral research, which, with exceptions as Darren has shared, can offer impoverished interpretations of animal subjectivity, or as Lessel and colleagues have said, the interpretations of the animal and the complexity of the animal depend largely on the creativity of the ethologist. So Linda Burke and Eileen Christ have advanced critiques of the natural sciences attempt at understanding animals, mutually suggesting that often animal behavioral research describes animals through the lens of performativity. Thus, an animal is articulated according to what characteristics are most heightened in that particular space. Take, for example, the ethogram, which is a list of predetermined and standardized species and spatial specific behaviors that is filled in during periods of observation. Slide. The ethogram is non-malleable and in a state of refusal to include instances of what are called interruptions in the production of data. So Becca Franks, as mentioned by Darren, speaks clearly to this, stating, models drive the experiments we choose to conduct, which dictates the data we collect, the inferences we draw, and the lives we construct for animals.
5 minutes left, thank you.
Oh, okay. So scholars not trained in the natural sciences, but still wanting to know and include animals as research participants, have embraced what is referred to as multi-species ethnography as an act to redress what Henry Buller refers to as the problem of the animal being given up to the natural sciences. So multi-species ethnography, from my understanding, is an attempt to recuperate animal behavioral research. Slide. And so moving on to like the crux of my session is that I think, frankly, CAS scholarship has significantly under-discussed what it means for animals to be research subjects. To come to this preliminary remark, I conducted a scan of the methodological approaches used in the articles published in the Journal for Critical Animal Studies, an open access peer-reviewed journal. I wanted to conduct this review to gauge who, according to this journal, represents a CAS scholar and what common methodological practices are deployed. The most common methods that I observed were qualitative, relying on secondary data such as literature reviews or archival research to make philosophical and rights-based claims, or primary data that relied on autoethnography or interviews. Methodologies that did engage explicitly with animals were raised, however, used to critique the deficiencies in animal behavioral research or to use them as tools to understand how we can use welfare to improve companion dogs' well-being. With the exception of 2 contributions, animals were largely absent in the methodological practices. So the 2 contributions that I observed were from the 2014 volume with Eva Meijer, where she examined her personal experiences with her stray dog, suggesting that She herself was the one that wrote the article, but Ollie's voice was very important. The second contribution was 5 years later in 2019 with Cynthia Rosenfield, who wrote about her multi-species study with human and snake encounters. So outside these two contributions, multi-species research, meaning animals as participants, was largely absent, which raises the question as to why. So to address why, thank you, I speculate that it relates to the methodological troubles multi-species ethnographers face. However, I want to flag the need for more, not less, CAS engagement. So multi-species ethnography attempts to shift practices from studying non-human animal life with conventional practices, such as reworking methodologies and creating new ways of researching across the species barrier. Dowling and co-authors offer three categories. The first is to use conventional methods such as discourse analysis. The second category available to multi-species ethnographers are methods that do more, such as participant observation or bearing witness. And then the third is collaboration and authorizing, what Maijur did in her 2014 contribution in the journal, which takes shape in experimentation, typically involving technology. However, this technology has also been critiqued in many ways. So something Darren and I wanted to speak about, and something we were talking about in preparation, was the question of what is the relationship between knowing animals more intimately, such as through the quick uptake of digital technologies and multi-species ethnography, versus broader liberation visions that are core to CACs. Are they connected? Does the knowledge that is being produced help with these broader liberation projects we're supposed to be advocating for? Which returned to the question posed by Gard that opened my section. Has CAS and recent uptake of multi-species ethnography been good for animals? My immediate response is not really, followed by the encouragement for more engagement, such as what's proposed in Principle 11, to become more involved with these recent multi-species methodological turns. And just to conclude, something that I did want to offer as something that I think about in my own work is, what if we spent more time writing contributions or statements of contributions to our participants' lives, such as non-research objectives advocated for in environmental justice literature, rather than just our contributions to literature? How would that bring us closer to the objectives of CAS? And I just wanted to offer the paper that's forthcoming by Van Patter and Plattner that focuses on the concept of beneficence, that grounds the fact that we do, when we have animals as research participants, have to consider how we can improve their lives materially. And now I pass it back to Darren for his final remark.
Just some final thoughts, I think, moving forward. In terms of critical animal studies relations with other fields and movements, I think those who are working in and through CAS will have to continue to struggle with clarifying our ontological commitments and worldviews. And by ontology, I just mean kind of like determining sort of the nature of reality that shapes how we relate to and understand other entities and beings in the world. So within CAS, Steph and I have observed roughly two tendencies and approaches, right? So there are those who are committed to commonly accepted critical animal studies principles and work towards connecting and aligning non-human animals to other movements and disciplines with the expectation that the shared commitments of other movements, for example, commitment to liberation and justice, would logically require them to accept and commit to CAS principles and values, and therefore sort of take animals' lives seriously. But then there are also those who are sort of committed to solidarity with other movements and building relationships with other disciplines, right? Despite possible incommensurabilities when it comes to relations with and understandings of non-human or more than human or other than human beings. And I think that tendency sort of is moving more towards taking seriously, for example, those who are trying to build solidarity with indigenous peoples really take the worldviews as a whole seriously and not simply so cherry picking parts, even though a lot of indigenous worldviews that recognize non-human agency is also compatible with the continued use and killing and exploitation of these other species of animals. And in terms of knowing other animals, just some thoughts. It is important to, I think, these two examples. So one, in terms of research work, I think farm sanctuaries really sort of as a place that is defined and sort of informed by liberatory ideologies, and really sort of limits what kind of research work could be done there, and how the animals could be known, and what we know about those animals. And so when we conduct research in these kinds of spaces, that could potentially be one way of kind of like more ethically knowing certain species that have in other bodies of knowledge and other parts of society being understood as simply commodities or exploitable beings. And another example is Alexis Pulling-Gumb's book on drowned black feminist lessons from marine mammals. And here I want to emphasize that it is really the framework through which we understand other species of animals and draw lessons from them, or like kind of like get you learn about these other species of animals that really matters, right? So if you read this book, Gumbs really talks about finding that a lot of these different marine mammal species are so relatable, and when aligning their experiences with the struggles of Black liberation, and that is an effective way of sort of starting a form of solidarity and mutual culture identifying with other species of animals. And so perhaps, I guess one of the more radical implications that I'm suggesting is perhaps CAS has arrived at a certain limitation, and that really we actually have to move towards really adopting fully that these other forms of knowledge from historically oppressed peoples that CAS has actually for a long time been drawing from, in order to, and then like rework our entire understanding of other species of animals from there. And just want to quickly shout out this article about these sort of ontological tensions that have influenced our thinking in this presentation, soon to be published. And it's talking about the relations between indigenous ontologies versus Western legal traditions, and how the two have a ton of tensions that can't be reconciled. So thank you. I think we're a bit over time. So those are our emails if you want to ask us more questions and stay in touch.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we've got time for, I think, a couple of questions, maybe more than a couple. So I wonder, okay, so I'll just start. Eva, do you have a question you would like to ask?
Yes, please. I will just start my camera. I hope it works. Yes, first of all, thanks to all speakers for their talks. That was amazing. And I do have a question for Darren and Stephanie. Your talk was just, wow. I think there was so much in there that I still need to process and that I need to think about. So my question would be about, you both brought up Eva Mayer's work as an example. And I would just like to hear some more from both of you about what you thought in particular in relation to her work, what was missing probably, because in Darren's part, it sounded like there was something missing from her approach. And from my reading of her book, I really took away the message that she was trying very hard to use the kind of knowledge also created in a Western context to improve animals' lives through also linking animal languages to the notion that animals have a political voice. So yeah, I think I didn't get what exactly you were critiquing, or if you actually were critiquing her approach. So maybe you can just say a few words about that.
So on my part, near the introduction, so I wasn't actually critiquing. I was kind of using her work as just an example of someone who is definitely committed to animal rights and animal liberation, drawing on ethology type work to sort of help us better understand how humans and other species communicate, right? And for her, this is very important because she's making an argument for why they can be incorporated into our democratic political institutions and stuff like that. And if anything that might be missing in her work, I suppose, is more, I guess, like further explanations of exactly how that process might work. And I think that's where maybe our discussions about different bodies of knowledge and how they shape institutions really matters, right? So perhaps there are certain things about relying on Western institutions and Western legal orders and traditions and political institutions that would actually continue to exclude other species of animals, because these institutions have already committed to certain ideas of what capacities are required in order to be considered a citizen, for example, to be included. Whereas if we really ditch that and adopt a wholly alternative, a quote unquote alternative worldview in indigenous legal tradition, many other species of animals have always been understood as persons already. They were already granted as agents who possess personhood. And even though they're still sort of killable and exploitable, but perhaps that would be sort of a totally different way of starting, a totally different starting point to make a more effective animal liberation argument. So I don't, Stephanie, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you summarized both of our positions on her work, and I've drawn from her work before when I was doing research with dogs. So yeah, she's just someone very interesting to think with.
I agree. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? There were quite a few hands up before, and I can't see any now. Anyone have a question for any of our speakers? Maybe our first two presentations? I'm hoping it's not something that I can't see for some reason. I can't see hands up. I saw quite a few up originally. Have you re-raised your hand, Eva?
Yes, I did. And just if no one else wants to speak, because I also have a question for Lukas. But I wanted to make sure first that there's no one else waiting to ask a question.
They don't seem to be waiting, so go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So Lukas, thank you for your talk again. Super fascinating. I've also thought a lot about animal resistance, and this is just maybe a little bit of a mean question, but if based on your research and your considerations, if you were asked to define animal resistance in a sentence or two, how would you go about that?
Yeah, it is a difficult question, because kind of the whole approach that I took is exactly doing the opposite of not trying to narrow down exactly what is animal resistance, but to try to keep it like as open as possible and to see it in different ways. And I think I kind of have to take that stance as well right now, because I think the beauty of resistance is that we can think about it in so many different ways, like I said, against concepts or against these technologies of violence. So I think the strength of the concept in this sense, in contrast to maybe the first presentation that we heard, is its openness and its flexibility, and we can use it in different ways. So I'm a bit hesitant to try to do a one-sentence definition, but there are, of course, definitions like Jason Reibel and Sarah Collins wrote the books, and they have very concise definitions about escaping and dragging their feet and all of these kind of very more empirical ideas about animal resistance. But I think just to stay true to my project here, I will keep it open, if that's okay. Yeah,
definitely. That was a brilliant answer.
Thank you. Steve, did you have a question? Steve, I'm sure I saw your hand up there.
Hello, yes. So now I was just also applauding Lukas's answer. Absolutely. I think that complexity that comes in, and then how we try to at times define something in a singular sense is sometimes unhelpful. And I thought Lukas's answer was superb. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It looks like I must have got a clap hand for a hand up. They look very similar. An issue with the programming of Zoom. Any other questions from anybody? You can also pop your questions in the chat if you have something or even a comment about anything. I can read that out. It may be of value to our presenters. Everyone's getting a little bit hungry and fatigued. Okay. Did any of the presenters have anything they wanted to communicate with in terms of any connections or threads between the papers, or any ways in which you felt the papers communicated with each other, or maybe helpful in your research, or anything like that? There are a few threads that came through. Yeah, Lukas?
Yeah, I actually thought that the three papers worked really nicely together in a sort of conversation, because we had like we need to define veganism more clearly. And then I said a few words about veganism as well, which were kind of the opposite direction, I guess, to keep it more open. But even so, I was thinking in my approach, I'm not very clear. And I think we can still have a very clear definition of saying veganism is, for example, against animal exploitation or something like this, and then still have like this open ethical reflection afterwards. Like we can clearly define the term, but not say that this is the end of what we're aiming for. So I think in this way, they're kind of communicating. And also with the last paper, I think Gelareh's approach of indistinction and new ontologies, new ways of thinking is exactly like this idea. And I mean, mine was just a small glimpse of that, and you kind of open that world even more explicitly with the questioning of scientific knowledge and also other ontologies and the dangers also associated with that. So I think there were very interesting links between all of them, and very, very helpful ones for me.
Yeah, I totally agree, actually, because Lukas, it's like one thing is just to be clear about what we're talking about, because if each one of us understand a concept differently, I think that we think that we are communicating, but in reality, we are just thinking and talking about different things. And the fascinating thing is, like, we know that research is growing, but in reality, and we have this feeling that we are like we know more about the phenomenon. And once that you stop and start thinking about it, you know that we are not getting that closer, because again, because we are thinking about different things, and I think this is necessary just to put some order in this from the research point of view, and also from activist point of view. And of course, that doesn't mean that it has to be the end. I totally agree with you. One thing is to also to understand that veganism is just the starting point, and you open up a new conversations and new also questions, relationship related to other causes and movements. That will be like the starting point. I totally agree. And also, even in the definition, I'm wondering if it's more Western, like I mean, like how we define veganism, who has the power again, who had the power to define what veganism is. And I'm probably, I mean, because the research comes from Anglo countries, Anglo-speaking countries. So that's also the discourse one is coming from. But what about other countries? For some Spanish-thinking countries, I mean, Spanish-speaking countries, probably they have other terms as well. So we need to incorporate that and be creative about the definition. Again, it's not just to, our paper is more about what has been done, but also opening a question that what do we want for the future? I think it's more focused in the future. What do we want, and what do we need to settle? And again, who has the power? The journals has the power to start defining what we think about our cause. And again, I totally agree. I think that we, the three of us, are connected. Yes. Very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your final comments as well. Thank you everybody for attending. That's the end of this session. And enjoy your lunch break, and we'll see you this afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.